Imagine, if you will, an ancient castle hiding a secret curse. The lord of the manor will do anything to keep the curse from destroying his family dynasty, including marrying his sickly son to a young woman. Everything depends on an heir to his fortune, and this man will make sure that happens at all costs. The curse, of course, comes to haunt the lord on the day of the fateful wedding. Pictures move, doors slam, and a giant ghostly knight can be seen stalking the castle. And that's just the beginning of the horror that haunts the halls. You're listening to the No Fear podcast. We know what scares you.
I'm Matt.
I'm Mel.
I'm Lisa.
And this is the No Fear Cast, the podcast where we dissect horror and all the things that scare us. This is episode 5, and in this episode, we're continuing our discussion of haunted houses. This will be the third of several episodes about this topic, so it might help to listen to them in order. All right, Lisa, while you were reading that intro, I was thinking this sounds like an episode of Scooby-Doo, but I don't think it is.
Yeah, so actually it was not a Scooby-Doo episode. It was Horace Walpole's novel, The Castle of Otronto, which came out first in 1764. And the reason I bring up The Castle of Otronto is because it is considered to be the start of the Gothic movement in literature. So if you've read Frankenstein, if you've read Dracula, if you read any of the novels of Anne Radcliffe when you were in English class, then you know a little bit about the Gothic genre, and Walpole is considered to be where it started.
Okay, where did the term Gothic come from? Why did that become the term that people called it?
You know, the term Gothic is one of those terms that I think a lot of people really don't understand, in part because today we use that term Gothic in such a vastly different way than we do when we're talking about it in regard to literature. So, for instance, when I tell people I study Gothic literature, nearly everybody thinks I just put on black lipstick and listen to, like, The Cure. But,
of course.
Well, I mean, obviously I do that anyway, but when we're talking about the Gothic as it relates to novels or in literature, especially as Walpole put it out, what we're talking about is first a term that he borrowed from architecture. And so when you look at some of these Gothic cathedrals, they are in contrast to the classical and the neoclassical. And he wanted to build a novel that was in opposition to the romance of the day. So he wanted to take the fantastical elements of romances, the knights, the princesses, the castles, but he also wanted to add in elements of reality. Kind of as a sidebar, he was also really obsessed with Gothic architecture, and he built a faux Gothic mansion in England called Strawberry Hill that is still there today. You can still go visit it. I think it's set up as kind of a museum. But one thing that he did is he wanted to write the stories that were set in the ancient castle, but then he wanted to add in certain, I guess we'll call them elements of reality. If you're at all familiar with Anne Radcliffe, like the Mistress of Udolpho, she was made famous for her explained supernatural. So it would seem like a ghost was haunting wherever they were. But really, there was always a real-world explanation behind it, which is something horror writers still play with today. But so what Walpole gives us in this book is you have the ancient castle, you have elements of patriarchal land rights. Basically, the story plot revolves around he needs an heir to keep the castle and his family. He's got one son who's very sick, and he needs to make sure that that son produces an heir to keep the family line going. And what that does is a couple of things. Is it puts women in direct danger because you have women and their bodies being caught up in this patriarchal struggle. And then you also have the haunting that's going on with it, if that makes sense at all.
All right, it's interesting, Lisa. And I was thinking while you were talking is one of the interesting things about the Gothic is that you can talk about just straight up Gothic literature, which is, literature written in England in the 1700s. But you also have the beginnings of America at the time, obviously toward the end of the 1700s. And Gothic kind of goes across the ocean and becomes part of a lot of our early American literature. So I'm thinking of folks like Charles Brockden Brown in his book Wieland, for example, which of course is famous for its wonderful spontaneous combustion scene, and Washington Irving, Rip Van Winkle, and The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, which of course we still have movie remakes even today. And so it takes a lot of what you were talking about, but it puts it in kind of an American spot. So you have much more concerns with religion, self-examination. When you mix Puritan ideals with isolation in a dangerous and unknown wilderness, you have things like the Salem witch trials come out of that. And as Gothic literature develops, I would argue that we still have Gothic in literature and movies today. It just deals with some of those dark aspects of ourselves and our history that we maybe don't want to talk about, like the Salem witchcraft trials or the treatment of Native Americans or slavery, for instance, some of the dark pockets of our history. And so one of the reasons why I think it's really cool that we brought up Otronto this time is you can trace any haunted house you want to talk about in pop culture or lit today back to that idea of hauntings originating in a family home, an isolated family home with these kinds of issues of identity and history and memory.
Right. Well, one thing that you have in present day that does connect back to Otronto, and it kind of goes through the lens of the American Gothic, you kind of see it, you can trace it going through all of it, is that, as you said, you do have this family home, which is something that's really important because you need that self-examination. But you also need something familiar in order to introduce the uncanny, which we've talked about a little bit in previous episodes. You need that for that juxtaposition. But then you also, usually in these haunted house narratives, is you have to set it in some sort of wilderness. And I'm using that in kind of air quotes when I talk about wilderness, because when you deal with the original, what you have in something like Otronto in the novels that came maybe in the 50 years after that is they would always travel to somewhere exotic, usually somewhere abroad, France, Italy, Spain. But the idea there was that they would be outsiders or they would be foreigners, and it would add to the anxiety of what they were experiencing. It added to the isolation, I guess. And from what you're telling me, Mel, is that when it went across the Atlantic and it kind of morphed into this American Gothic, is you had this new idea of a wilderness. And again, they were outsiders, which would add to the anxiety of what they were experiencing. And I'm wondering, I'm guessing we do see that in the haunted houses that we get today, is that sense of isolation, but also that sense of wilderness attached to it.
Yeah, being in a place that you maybe don't understand or don't fit in. And that could also be, it could be social isolation. I think it could also be mental isolation. I mean, I think you could still have Gothic literature even in an urban area, because I don't think the isolation has to be purposefully spatial. Though your traditional Gothic haunted house is going to be like on a moor somewhere, or in a forest, or if you're thinking of Brockden Brown's Wieland, in a rural area because they don't want to live in the city. And I think that kind of comes from romance, because romance kind of glorifies nature, and the Gothic shows us how negative and scary the isolation and kind of gigantic aspect sometimes of natural wilderness can be. But you're right. I mean, I think you can kind of have a wilderness of the mind, or even a social wilderness. You don't necessarily need to be lost in a forest somewhere like the Blair Witch Project.
Well, the idea of the woods is really integral to the Gothic, because usually what you would have is a main character, particularly a female main character, who at the beginning of the book had an established relationship to nature, whether she would go out and enjoy long walks, or she felt more like herself when she was, it was a very Snow White type existence for these early Gothic heroines.
Writes poetry.
Right. Well, exactly. I mean, there would be, especially in Radcliffe, you would see somebody out writing poetry in the middle of the forest. And so the wilderness is established as both a place of innocence and creativity, but also a place where you can be isolated and find yourself in danger where you can't get any help. So it was this weird dichotomy or dual personality that the wilderness had. And to some degree, we still have that today. We have movies like The Blair Witch. You go into the woods and you never come out again. But then you can just as easily have a dangerous house that is right in the middle of a city.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I'm thinking the nature thing, I was just thinking you can go for a walk and recharge your batteries and, kind of get away from that kind of urban corruption, as romantics would say. But you could also get attacked by a mountain lion, or fall off the side of a cliff or something. So, yeah, I mean, there's tons of horror in the natural world. But, taking it back to the house, and you were talking about the house being an urban area, I think one of the things that makes houses so good for haunted literature per se is because of that kind of houses are very attached to our identities. And I think we talked about that before as houses standing in for people's minds or people's families. But houses are also liminal places where multiple kind of times can be as one. So if multiple generations lived in a house, you have your entire past in that house. If you take over a house from someone else, you may find things in that house that are indicators of a past before you were there. And so houses, because they are so deeply connected to us as people and our identities, they become kind of places to keep, or maybe even crypts to hide our memories in. It could be memories we don't want to pay attention to that we repress, or it could be memories that we're trying to discover, or maybe memories that somebody else's memories that are haunting us. So haunting becomes a metaphor for whatever, social, historical, whatever trauma may have happened in that house, or for whatever that particular individual living in the house is going through at the time.
Now, I hesitate to bring it up because I'm not finished with the book yet, but I'm in the middle of reading White for Witching at the moment. And that is one thing that I really see in that book is that Helen Oyeyemi, excuse me, as she's constructing the narrative, she actually lets the home itself speak as if it's a character. And one thing that's really interesting is that the house, and I want to be very careful how I describe this here, because it's not a house that's alive in the way that we've talked about, like the Overlook Hotel was alive in The Shining, or Hill House is alive in Shirley Jackson's book. It's not necessarily a bad place or a house that's evil. It's more of the house itself is connected to the family and is connected to the generations of the family that have lived there. And in that way, the house is almost recording not only the past of the family that lives there, but is reminding the current members of that history.
Have either of you read Slade House yet?
Yes.
I have.
Okay. How do you think that one fits in? And for those of you listening, David Mitchell, it's a companion piece to his super long, amazing book, The Bone Clocks, which is more sci-fi than anything. But Slade House, I think you could really say is sort of a haunted house story. And as you're talking about this idea of keeping the past, you go through 40, 50 years worth of time with this house that's sort of haunted by these psychic vampires. It's a really crazy, insane book that's a lot of fun. But do you think that one would fit in as a keeper of the past as well?
I think it would. And that was one of the reasons, Matt, that I was hesitant to even bring up White is for Witching, because I read Slade House almost immediately before I picked up White is for Witching. And I was worried that maybe that was coloring my reading of the book. Because I do feel like Slade House in particular, yes, it's haunted by the psychic vampires or whatever you want to call them, the entity that's in the house, but especially in reference to the bone clock that's there and some of the paintings that hang there. It seems like the house itself has its own personality separate from the brother and sister that are manipulating it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. And as you say, keeper of the past. I think one of the things that I thought was so neat about that story is that the victims, I don't remember how long the brother and sister wait between feedings. I want to say it was like 7 or 9 or 10 years, something like that. But each of those victims, every 10, however many years, it starts bleeding through so that, later victims will be seeing these echoes and traces of these previous victims and say, hey, wow, that person looks like they're in like 60s garb, or, oh, what's this And so that sort of past stuff all bleeds over into whatever the present time happens to be, because it, takes place over about 40 years' time.
Yeah, the word echoes is a really good description, I think, of what you get in that book. Because as each new character walks into the story, they hear literal echoes from the past victims, but they see things, they experience things, they feel things, and I get the sense that the house has almost recorded them. And they're serving as both warnings, because you feel like at some point, if people put it together soon enough, that they could leave and avoid their fate. But then again, there's almost this sense of inevitability in the way that the past victims interact with the soon-to-be victims, I guess.
Well, and there's also the connections between the victims, too, because as it goes on, each victim has more of a connection to a previous one. And so you have kind of that passing the past down, I guess. So you not only have the victims seeing the souls of the other people, or like flashbacks of them, or them bleeding through, but you'll have someone know that someone disappeared and be trying to investigate it or talk to other people, and then they end up being the next victim. So it connects the people who go into the house, just like the house is haunted by those people. Which
is one thing that's interesting, and it makes me want to go back and reread the book, because that's one thing that's really interesting about that is the psychic twins, the villains, the brother and the sister vampire duo, whoever they are. They're laying a trap for new victims to come. And I can't tell if they're trying to erase the past of what they've done so that they can continue to do it and continue this kind of immortal life. Or, as you said, Mel, if they're choosing victims and then using those victims to lay a trail to bring in more victims, if that makes sense.
It's kind of their downfall, though, because the more the victims become connected, the more the new victim is kind of primed to be looking out for a trap. And yeah, I mean, you do get the vampire's whole history at some point, because it's kind of embedded in the psychic makeup of the house. Like their minds, the house isn't really real. The house is kind of this psychic projection that they keep up in order to trick the people.
That's what I was going to say, is that it's actually the house itself, once people enter its grounds, is like, I think literally described as being in a time bubble. Like it's frozen in a particular place because the house itself gets destroyed in the bombings in World War II. Except when you go through this, door in a wall that takes you into what the grounds would have been. And so like it literally is keeping the past in that case in a bubble. And so they're sort of, in some ways, I would say even kind of haunting themselves. Like their own past is continuing to haunt them because they can't escape it. I mean, they can psychically leave, I think, at some point, but they always are physically tied to that place. The physical grounds are keeping the past alive as well as what they're doing with their victims.
Yeah. Slade House is as much a product of the actual place it's in as it is the past that these vampires have created over the years.
Yeah, this may be going off on too much of a tangent, but maybe not. But I'm thinking the Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children. I mean, the home is stuck in a time loop to hit the house. And so when the main character kind of falls into the time loop, it's like he goes from, the 21st century to the 1940s. And there it's to protect themselves, not to victimize people. But this idea of like history repeated, but in that case you don't ever make it past that day that they're frozen in. They just keep reliving it over and over again.
Well, that's kind of the nature of the past and history, isn't it? It's going to keep repeating itself until whatever lesson is needed to be learned is learned. And I think that's why haunted houses, when we think of the classic haunted house, is that it always tends to be this exact type. It's we get much more of a keeper of a past, and we're going to loop this past until something happens to disrupt that cycle, rather than a haunted house, that bad place, or just somebody who's maybe dealing with something psychologically and is projecting that on the house. I feel like the most traditional haunted houses are house as keeper of the past. And maybe it's because of that very nature of the past needing either to repeat itself as it does with Slade House, or I haven't read that other one, Mel, or the past is just going to keep showing up until it's dealt with, as in something like Rebecca, or even Toni Morrison's Beloved.
Oh yeah, well, you were talking about cyclical past. I was thinking of Beloved, because Beloved is created. The book itself kind of is a cyclical representation of the past, because in the first part of the book, you have Setha, who has killed one of her children so that they wouldn't be returned to slavery, because her experience in slavery was so traumatic. She would rather herself and her children be dead than be back in it. And she spends all her time, quoting Morrison, beating back the past because she doesn't want to think about it. But her house is haunted by the child that she killed, which makes her face it even when she doesn't want to. And then you have the second part of the book where it comes out what happened, and then she says, I don't have to think about it anymore, but she just keeps repetitively thinking about it, because this is this one kind of traumatic thing in her life that she'd been trying to repress. But now that she can see the daughter as a fully fledged bodily spirit, she keeps reliving it over and over again. And at the end of the book, a very similar thing happens to when she killed her daughter, but instead of going after her child, she tries to protect her child from the outsider coming in. And, some critics read that as kind of like breaking that traumatic cycle, that she does something different. And at that point, maybe there's room for some sort of healing. But yeah, this idea of you can try to hide from it, but it'll just keep coming back and back and back until it goes from a kind of poltergeist phenomenon to a fully fledged woman walking into your life, whatever it takes for you to deal with your past. Her and also the reader, it also forces the reader to face up to the past of slavery, which, as Morrison has pointed out numerous times, is something that we're not very good at doing.
Well, and that's kind of the conventional wisdom about ghosts, is that they are people who've, you always hear unfinished business or some sort of trauma that they're, reliving. And so the whole goal of, paranormal people who are trying to end hauntings is to help the ghost find that sort of closure. I mean, when you think about it as that trauma or whatever being this relived past, I mean, it makes a whole lot of sense to expand that into something like the trauma of slavery.
Yeah, that's what makes Beloved, I think, a really interesting text when you look at it as a haunted house novel, because you have the house as the keeper of the past, both on the personal level, where Setha is trying to overcome her own traumatic experience with her child, and she's having to confront it. And I can only imagine that as a parent, losing a child under any circumstances is one of those things that you're probably just never going to get over. You can face that trauma as many times as you want, and you're not going to break that cycle. But then she also has the kind of social trauma that she's dealing with of slavery. And that's one of the things that I think makes Beloved a really interesting haunted house narrative to look at, because you are getting it from two points of view, which is something you don't get a whole lot of. Most of the time it's one or the other. It's either personal or social, but not both. And that makes it a really strong haunted house narrative.
Well, Mel, I know you've also done a lot of work in particular, well, the both of you, but I know I'm more familiar with Mel's work on the idea of what's called social ghosting. Do you think now would be a good time to kind of bring that up?
Sure. I could talk about that a little bit with regard to Beloved, especially if listeners are familiar with that book. And yeah, I started out my academic career writing on Toni Morrison's novels and ghosts. So that's where my book Spectrality and the novels of Toni Morrison kind of came from. But yeah, I mean, you have many different kinds of ghosts in Beloved, which I think is really interesting. Going off of what Lisa was saying about personal versus social cultural past, also everybody in the book is haunted. Every character who had any sort of experience with slavery, from her neighbors to Paul D, to her daughter Denver, to her mother-in-law, baby Suggs. In the end, the group of 20 women who come to try to help exorcise Beloved, every single person, even her white landlord who had been abolitionist, every single person in the book who sees that house when Beloved is in it or bumps into Beloved at some point is automatically thrown back into a memory that has to do with slavery, so that it's not Beloved is haunting Setha because of that personal connection with her, but she haunts everybody else who is related to that particular point of history. But the social ghosting aspect is this idea that characters who are not necessarily dead, who are still alive, are kind of suffering through almost a kind of social death per se. But I was using the term social ghosting because I thought that there was some possibility that these characters could return from this condition. So if you're familiar with Beloved, like Setha and Denver have almost no community connections because of what Setha did. They've been kind of dropped by the people who live around them. And because of their marginalized status as African Americans and women in the time period of the novel, and their marginalized status in their own community because of Setha's actions, you can look at that book, you can look at those characters in that book in that house as just as ghostly in some ways as the ghost that's kind of popping out of the afterlife haunting them. And so one of the things I've done in some of my writing on Toni Morrison's novels is kind of look for these characters that seem so marginalized that they're almost ghostly while they're still alive. Because unfortunately in American literature, and I think I talked about this in another episode, we like to take people who are marginalized, who are oppressed and kind of turn them into ghosts in their own books. And I think Morrison does a really interesting point of focusing the attention on those characters who maybe wouldn't have gotten that attention in earlier literature.
I know it doesn't have anything to do directly with haunted houses, but whenever you've brought up the idea of social ghosting, just when we've been talking, I always think of Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, because that character is living on the margins of society and even describes himself as being completely invisible, as being almost this ghostly-like character.
Yeah, when you mention those marginal characters who live in those liminal spaces, they may be alive, but they're existing as ghosts within the text. You have to talk about Shirley Jackson's We Have Always Lived in the Castle and what's going on in Blackwood Manor, because she does not construct Blackwood Manor as a traditional haunted house per se, but the townspeople construct the manor house to be haunted. It becomes, for those of you, well, first of all, if you have not read We Have Always Lived in the Castle, I highly recommend it. But what you have is a house that is set up from the beginning to be a haunted house. You have an entire family that was murdered with the exception of a few people. And so we assume that we're going to see their ghosts at some point. But the townspeople have made their own stories and legends and children's rhymes that go along with Blackwood Manor. In the same way that as kids, I don't know if any of y'all did this, but when we would jump rope to Lizzie Borden. Did any of y'all do that, or am I the only one?
I didn't jump rope, but I do know that. But I do know the rhyme.
You know the rhyme, right?
I don't remember saying it while I was jumping.
Oh, well, maybe we were just, I guess because we counted the whacks that she did as we were jumping, so...
You were just creepy children.
Well, we will cover that on a separate episode. But I distinctly remember doing this, and we had the Lizzie Borden took an axe, gave her mother 40 whacks, and there's something very similar that goes on in We Have Always Lived in the Castle, and then so in that way, the townspeople construct their own story around Blackwood Manor, and they make it the haunted house to the point that they're afraid. The adults and the children alike are afraid of the people who live there because of everything that has happened in the past. And the two Blackwood sisters who still live in the house are ghosts when they leave. Maricat, the main character, she talks about how she can go into places, and she's very much described as an outsider in the town. Nobody interacts with her in a normal way. They either ignore her or they're confrontational to her. And what's interesting, Mel, is this is what started this whole tirade, is that when you said in Beloved, and were you talking about social ghosting, is how that term implies that that person can come back from the margins and rejoin society. Is, as I'm reading We Have Always Lived in the Castle, you assume that Merricat and her sister can come back, that they can enjoy a normal life at some point. They, by the end, make the decision that they're going to continue living as ghosts haunting their castle.
Yeah, they embrace it.
Yeah, absolutely. But so it's one of those things where that's one of the interesting things of looking at social ghosting, particularly in the haunted house narrative, is what choice does that character make? Are they going to rejoin society, or are they going to embrace being a ghost?
Well, and Shirley Jackson was great with that, which, I know we've talked about Hill House, the haunting of Hill House before, so I don't want to get into it too much, but I have always thought that it's interesting to look at Eleanor as the ghost of the house, because she's pretty ghostly in her own life, not able to fit into, how you think that women should be, quote unquote, in the 1950s. And she goes to the ultimate, haunted house and just kind of becomes ghostly, literally, at the end in some ways. But just showing certain characters' place in society through that metaphorical lens. It happens in so much literature.
Yeah, it becomes a really interesting space to talk about race and gender in particular within texts, I think.
Because, what do we do when we fear something? We tell a scary story about it, and what do we fear? We fear people who are different than us, unfortunately. And I was thinking while you were talking about We Have Always Lived in the Castle, this is going to seem kind of out of left field, I suppose, but Grace Metalius's Peyton Place, the character Hester Goodale, who is the quote-unquote spinster, who defies the town no matter what they try to do, and they tell all these horrible stories about her and how she, was unable to marry, etc., and her overbearing father. But what ultimately happens is the children all talk about how her house is the haunted house. It's a haunted house, and she's the ghost, or she's the witch, and the main character writes an Edgar Allan Poe story about it. No supernatural things at all. It's just a woman who doesn't fit in and doesn't act the way she, quote unquote, should act. And people kind of say, well, that's the haunted house of the town. Even though all the other houses are horribly haunted by the terrible things that are happening inside of them, she gets kind of singled out for that othering.
Which is interesting when you think about who is constructing the haunted house narrative. Is it the actual author of the novel, or is it the society in which the novel is set that is constructing that?
And how the author is responding to that society.
Right.
Is the author trying to tell a story that hasn't really been told before, or hasn't been visible before? Or is the author kind of showing how society treats these characters? I guess that would go from whether you embrace being ghostly, or whether you find a way to get back in your community, or whether you end up, unable to fit, so to speak.
Right. Which brings up an interesting point about power. If you're one of these ghosted characters, I always assumed that would mean the power was stripped away from you because you could not join, quote unquote, normal society. But if you were just talking about a ghost in a traditional haunted house narrative, I would assume that those ghosts are pretty powerful in how they can manipulate the people that they interact with.
Oh, yeah. That's kind of the double-sided coin, right? A witch character is seen as powerful, but she's also scorned by society, and so, it depends on how you wield it. Are you the powerless one that lacks choices, or do you find some sort of power in that kind of situation? Maxine Hong Kingston's Woman Warrior, her family uses the metaphor of ghostliness to talk about Americans once they immigrate from China to America because of the language barrier, etc. But you also have the mother telling her daughter these stories about warrior women who had this amazing power and could kind of manipulate supernatural things. And so it's yes, on the one hand, maybe ghosts can mean kind of the other, or an inability to communicate, or marginalization. But then if you interpret it in your own way and you use it in a different way, it can lead to a position of power. I guess kind of like the end of We Have Always Lived in the Castle. Okay, if they're going to treat us like ghosts and marginalized people, we're just going to totally embrace it. And, we're going to put spells on them and scare the crap out of them and live however we want,
You can try to burn down our house, but that's fine. We'll pick up the pieces and move on.
Right, yeah.
So, Mel, when you're talking about all this concept of social ghosting, to me it sounds like a very postmodern idea in literature. We're talking about Whitest for Witching and Beloved and pretty current haunted house narratives. But the idea of social ghosting, now that I think about it, really goes all the way back. You can trace it to the Castle of Otronto, because the character, and I referenced it in the beginning, it all takes place at a wedding. Manfred, who's the lord of the manor, is marrying his son to this woman, and she really has no agency in the entirety of the novel. She's just kind of picked out of nowhere to marry this man's son. The son is very sickly, unattractive. I can't imagine that anybody would think he would make a good husband. And when he dies, Manfred actually says, well, my one son has died. I cannot let my lineage end here. I will marry you. And so he basically just hijacks the wedding. He is married still to his son's mother, but he's just going to forget about that and marry this other woman to have more children. And she is a prisoner in all of this, change. She goes from son to father. And then I laugh because it's such a ridiculous idea now, but a peasant randomly shows up at the castle and saves the day and rescues her and whisks her away. But even in that, she has absolutely no agency of her own. She really is the ghost. Yes, there is a ghost of a knight that is haunting the castle, but the woman in the midst of this entire struggle really is the true ghost of Otronto, because she has no choice or no say in what happens to her, in who she marries, or even in who saves her in the end. So really, when you go back to this idea of taking people who had, of course, back in the mid-1700s in England, women did not have any rights at all, especially if they were not attached through marriage to somebody. Everything either belonged to a male family member or their husbands. And so in that way, she is the ghost. It's interesting when you see how very little has changed, I guess, in the haunted house novels, now that I think about it.
Well, even though not a lot has changed in some ways about haunted houses, there's certainly a lot that has happened in recent years, in the last 20, 30 years, which is actually what we're going to be covering next time on our No Fear podcast. We're going to be talking about haunted houses that can be portals, and we'll also be talking about postmodern houses. So if you're a fan of House of Leaves or Joe Hill's Lock and Key comic series, check us out then.
This is the No Fear podcast. You can find us online at Twitter and Instagram at No Fear Cast. That's KNOW Fearcast. Or our website, nofearcast.com. If you want to contact us, send an email to nofearcast@gmail.com. Download us through iTunes, Stitcher, or anywhere else podcasts are found. If you like what you hear, leave us a 5-star review on iTunes. Or you can support us on Patreon. Even a little bit makes a big difference. The No Fear Cast. We know what scares you. This is a personal project and not related to any academic institution.